Happy Thursday, everyone out there. I wasn't really fully intending on coming on live today because I'm a little under the weather. You can probably hear I've got like the tail end of sore throat, kind of swollen glands, but I've recovered well enough that I should be okay. So I had a couple of requests to talk about a few bits, so I thought a live was probably the best way to do it, because that way more than one of you can see it. This one is mainly for this one's mainly for Jean, because she had some questions about swatching, and I am going to attempt to answer them as best I can. Swatching is kind of an interesting one because it's essential to knowing what's going on with your project, but there's also no complete answer to it. There's a lot of personal judgment comes in when you're not getting exactly what you're looking for. Hey everyone, thanks for popping in and joining me. I'm just getting started talking a little bit about swatching, in particular swatching in relation to Laminaris. Laminaris hasn't quite started yet, so that's going to be the summer knit-along that will be starting next week. So the first clue will come out next Thursday, so you've still time to jump in if you want. I've also added something to the website actually that may be of interest to you. If you didn't really like any of the color combinations that I'd put together for the Laminaris kits, I've actually, for the next week, just until the first clue comes out, I have now, hey Kim, I've added the I've added the option of using the Laminaris 10 discount for all of the newest sport for the next week, because that means that you can actually put your own color combinations together if you want to. So I thought that would give you a little bit more freedom if there was different colors you'd like to use. So just for the next couple of days until the first clue comes out. I see Jean is here. Jean, I was going to talk a little bit about your swatching dilemma. So the question Jean asked in Facebook was in relation to swatching, and specifically she had done 2 swatches, stockinette stitch and the double garter stitch in 2 different needle sizes. One was a slightly stiffer, firmer, probably more durable fabric. The other one was more open and a little bit more drapey. Neither of them were exactly the right gauge. Now, Jean, you might pop up there where you said exactly the right gauge. Was one a little too loose and another a little too tight, or were they both in the too tight direction? I'm not really sure in relation to that. So the question you've got when you're swatching, you're looking for a couple of different things. Ideally, you'll get a fabric that you like. So when you pick it up, it feels like a fabric you'd like to wear and it feels like a good garment fabric to you, and you're getting gauge. So that's, in an ideal world, you're looking for those 2 things. That's not always going to be the case. You might end up getting one or the other. It might be that you comfortably knit at a different gauge, even with the same yarn, or you might have changed the yarn to a thicker or a thinner yarn, or just, it could be any of those combinations of things. So the most important thing, both were a bit too big, Jean. There we go. If both were a bit too big, that makes the question a little bit easier. So the gauge was a little bit loose on both. Is that correct? A little bit looser than mine. So by big, you mean instead of 22 stitches per 4 inches, it was like 21 stitches per 4 inches. So anyway, back to swatching in general. So in an ideal world, you've got both of those. So then after that, what you want to look at is the fabric. Is it going to, and it's to a certain extent personal choice. Like when you pick up the fabric, which of those fabrics feels like it would be more comfortable to wear? And if it's something that's going to get quite a bit of abuse, is it going to be durable enough? Because generally speaking, the stiffer or the tighter fabric is knit, the tougher it's going to have a little bit more resistance, because if you've got a loosely knit fabric, it allows the stitches to rub against each other. So you are, generally speaking, with a looser gauge, particularly if you're knitting with a soft yarn, a looser stitch is more likely to kind of move a little bit against each other. Okay, there's another post here. I have to go down several needle sizes to get gauge with newest sport. I've had more experience with Blosta, is it common to need to use smaller sizes with the softer yarn? Melissa. It can sometimes be. What I actually find is not so much the softness, I think it's actually the yak in the yarn. There's a certain amount of slippiness to it. And sometimes I find that I actually need to use a wooden needle to try and get a little bit more grip so it doesn't slip. Because that's, so sometimes a different needle type can give you a bit more grip. Sometimes you might need to drop down needle size. My experience is that I need to have a grippier type needle. And I do find with Nua, and I'm fairly certain it's the yak and the fact that it's just got a little bit more slip and smoothness to it. It tends to knit loosely. It just doesn't, you know, the stitches flow through my fingers very easily. The yarn flows through my fingers very easily. And so I think I don't hold it as tightly. And so I end up with a slightly looser gauge. So I would definitely suggest experimenting with the different types of needles. So wood or perhaps metal, you know, go back and forth and try with the two of those. So if you get a fabric that you like and you think is going to be durable enough what you want, the next thing then is to see how close it is to your gauge. Stitch gauge is usually going to be more important in most things, because stitch gauge, like obviously I'm assuming it's being knit, you know, up, down, or down, up, so to speak, as opposed to side, because stitch gauge is going to determine how wide your garment is. So if you've got a looser stitch gauge and you've got more stitches, what ends up happening is it's going to get, if you don't make any adjustments, it's going to be too big if you knit it at the size. But if you like that looser gauge and you think it feels good to you and you feel more comfortable knitting with that, then what you need to do is adjust your size. You need less stitches. So that might be as simple as perhaps knitting a smaller size, but still going with the rows or the depths for the size you want, but using the stitches for a smaller size so that the widths are going to be correct. You can tell that by just doing some calculations on your gauge, saying if I've got 20 stitches rather than 22, and just putting one over the other, and you're going to get a fraction, and then you can see that, compare that to what the gauge should be, and it's going to give you an idea of what your finished size will end up being with the wrong gauge. So if you're kind of curious to read a little bit more about that, my teachable class, Fit Your Knits, can be useful, or in the knit alongs I usually give little hints as well on how to adjust gauge if you need to. So that's just kind of the general thing on gauge. And you don't need to be a slave to it, but you have to be very aware of it and you have to make adjustments with it. But I think that the fabric and the feel of the fabric is more important than anything else, because if you don't like the way it feels, then there's no point trying to force it to do something that it doesn't want to do, if that makes any sense. Also with this, you're going to have two different gauges. So you've got the stockinette stitch gauge here, and then the second half down here is going to be the double garter stitch gauge. It's quite useful, the fact that they're in two different sections, and that means that if you find that you get gauge with one but you need a different needle for the other to also get gauge, you can go ahead and change the needle size. It won't cause any problems because you're not doing them both in the same row. One finishes and the next one starts, so just use a different needle size for that. But I think the big thing that I'm kind of coming up with looking at people here is possibly the need to try different types of needle and going with what feels best for you. If both of them are a little too big, then I'd probably go with the one that's going to be a little bit closer to the stitch gauge, because you'll have less adjustments to make, unless you really dislike the fabric, in which case go with the other one and just do a little bit of calculation, because there'll be less calculation, obviously. More with one, less with the other, but leave the feel of the fabric be your guide, is the best way to put it. So that's my little chat on Swatch, and if what I'm saying doesn't quite make sense, or you've got a few more questions in relation to it, just pop them up on the questions here underneath.